Greek tragedy is one of the oldest genres of storytelling, one in which the characters within are brought to their unfortunate end, and often by the designs of the gods. But it can be all too easy to mistake the tragic hero as simply the victim of a cautionary tale, to see them as characters who got it wrong or failed where others didn't, a reminder of who not to be. These figures are quite often accomplished and capable in their own right, and at the very least, they're unwaveringly steadfast in their goals or belief. Often, we see how this leads to their downfall. Hubris, an excess of pride or defiance, causes a tragic character to be humbled. In modern narratives, hubris is often the misplaced values and beliefs a character has which ultimately leads them to experience a downfall. But the tragic arc exists for much more of a purpose than to teach us about making the right or wrong decisions to avoid being prideful and screwing up. The great heroes of the ancient world, who did the impossible and were favored by their gods, were still unable to avoid the simplest pitfall known to humankind: failure. Often, their mistakes were made with innocent or even noble intentions. The passing of a law in hopes of improving society, the decision to trust a loved one, or the act of marrying the best available match for a better future. All of these things could suddenly lead a hero down a drastic road to disaster. In such circumstances, the characters might not have even done anything wrong other than to simply remain true to themselves and what they believed. Their failures are simply an unavoidable reality of who they are. The Greeks appreciated tragedy because it told the tale of how all of us, whether it be the king, the hero, or the farmer, all of us were destined to one day meet with our own failures. These stories were reminders that none of us were above being humbled. Greek philosophers believed that we all struggled with hubris, and the tragic stories of the ancient world had that exact reminder woven into it. In a lot of ways, it was a matter of making characters easier to connect with, almost like how modern stories emphasize character flaws and believability. Tragedy is used to give depth to otherwise morally black and white stories, to heroes who might otherwise seem unrelatable and larger than life. With the tragic arc, they suddenly become human like you and I. Whether it's as serious for a character as death, or as simple as embarrassment, they face an outcome that is inevitable and simply cannot be changed. Usually, they're destined by the story or their own nature to fail, and this fallibility is an outcome that only the most deluded characters think is impossible for them. But whatever the case, they become far more than just the cut and dry figures populating a story. The tragic arc is quite possibly the most realistic human experience in all of storytelling. This isn't to say that in order to make characters relatable or real, they now need to become horribly flawed, toxic, and unbearable to be believable. Tragedy is not exactly about character flaws, even if it's about hubris. Sometimes it's the result of simply being true to oneself amid circumstances that are beyond one's control. We see this with characters like Ned Stark in Game of Thrones, with his honor, or his son Robb, with love and marriage. Both characters chose to be true to what they believed in, and they paid dearly for it. Had the world around them been a better place, their honor and love would have prevailed. That's the tragedy of it all. In Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, Okonkwo refuses to adapt his beliefs to fit the changes being brought into his culture by Western colonization. Ultimately, he meets a tragic demise because he's unwilling to change, though doing so would have represented the usurpation of his people and culture. His arc puts us, the reader, into a difficult conflict between whether we would want to be forced to change by others, or would choose to remain who we've always been and suffer as a result. Neither option is a win, and that's the point the novel is trying to make about the tragedy of colonization. Okonkwo wasn't a hero who needed to eventually face down a physical villain. He was a man trying to live a life in a way that he believed was right. That was what got him in trouble. Even in small doses, where the stakes don't have to be death, A tragic arc leaves audiences engaged, raising questions and circumstances that leave us searching for resolution. Your story doesn't need to follow a tragedy all the way down the rabbit hole, ending at the downfall of your hero. Plenty of stories using this arc have followed how a character faces their circumstances and perhaps even overcomes them. As writers, we can capitalize on that. In reality, we're all doomed to experience some form of failure. It's a universal experience that will teach us a lot about ourselves. And a character's response to inevitable failure teaches us a lot about how they view the world and what's important to them. If the stakes involve being rejected by a love interest, and we see them harbor bitterness in their heart for years, that says a lot about them. If they handle the same situation by laughing fondly over it and moving on, that says a lot as well. Both situations create depth for a character and connects us to them. Now multiply that effect when the stakes are higher. Think about characters who put their heart and passion into a belief that's misguided and doomed to result in their death. Who do they become when they finally understand their failure is inevitable? Think about why so many people throughout time have been obsessed with the idea of lovers who are destined never to be with one another. They ask, how will they make it work? The way a character handles the impossible says a lot about why we should care about them, and readers become all the more invested when they see it play out. When faced with the tragic arc, the best characters demonstrate who they become under those circumstances. Great villains are born from a tragic arc. They follow their hubris so faithfully, perhaps even as the world changes and no longer fits their beliefs. Heroes that we deeply root for will travel the ups and downs of their belief system, seeing it through to the inevitable consequences, and then having to face them in order to do better. Perhaps they change, perhaps they fall. And sure, we can have characters who remain static all throughout a story as well, but even that provides for a great character arc. What happens to a character who refuses to be a part of the rest of the world around them, as it changes and grows while they remain a constant? Do they fit in? Are they stuck in the ways of the past? Do they now struggle with having the right answers while the rest of the world falls apart and refuses to listen? Hubris affects everyone, and this is because it's not a matter of good morals and bad morals leading to good or bad consequences. It's the destiny of failure, misfortune, mistakes, all of which occur simply as one does what they believe is right. For people of the ancient world, I can only imagine how common it was for death, sickness, famine, and war to simply strike and ruin even the best moments of a person's life. For them, the important question was not to ask how to avoid these things, but instead, how we should handle them when they appear. Take, for example, the story of Oedipus Rex. For those who don't know, this was a Greek hero who was foretold to end up killing his father and marrying his mother. Out of fear of this prophecy, his parents, the king and queen of Thebes, had him taken to the wilderness as a baby to die. Instead, he survives and is raised by the king and queen of Corinth. In adulthood, Oedipus learns of his terrible prophecy. But since he has always believed himself to be the legitimate son of the Corinthian monarchs, he decides to leave his home behind in order to do everything he can to avoid the prophecy and protect his parents. Then, in his travels, he encounters an old man along a narrow road, and literally over a traffic dispute, the two men come to blows. In the end, Oedipus kills the man and continues along his way. Little did he know, this man was his real father, the king of Thebes. And around the time Oedipus arrives at Thebes, the city has been left in turmoil. Long story short, he saves the city and is granted the queen's hand in marriage. As the new king, he goes on to rule wisely and always has the right answer for every problem that comes up. But a plague strikes the city. The gods have cursed Thebes for kinslaying and dishonoring the sacredness of family. When Oedipus tries to get to the bottom of this, his queen figures it out long before he does and tries desperately to warn him to ignore the truth. But Oedipus is desperate to save his city. He's committed to help his people, and he wants more than anything to relieve their suffering. Why would he ever back down? He's the king. It's his duty. So finally, he uncovers the truth, and it sickens him. It shames and sickens all of them. He had thought himself above the failure he was doomed to meet, and that was simply untrue. In some versions, he takes his own life, but in Sophocles' version, the more well-known version, he blinds himself and goes into exile out of shame. What's amazingly tragic about this story is not that Oedipus actually deserved his fate. In his mind, he genuinely believed that he was protecting his birth parents, that he was ruling Thebes justly and heroically, only to find out it was all a lie and he'd failed all along. He'd missed all of the signs and had simply been happy to play the part of father and ruler, not knowing that he'd been damned from the start. The play, Oedipus at Colonus, details the final days of Oedipus as he takes refuge in the territory of the Athenians. Here, he comes to understand that there was nothing he could do to change his fate, believing that it was unavoidable, and because of fate, no fault of his own. He had simply done what he thought was best. His brother-in-law and antagonist, Creon, mocks him and says otherwise, but regardless of any fault, there really isn't anything that can undo what's been done. While the family falls apart around him, Oedipus realizes that all he can do is take stock of those who are good to him, such as his daughters and his new Athenian friend, the hero Theseus. He refuses to bless either of his sons as they prepare to go to war against one another, firmly denouncing the kinslaying, even as he himself had unwittingly been guilty of doing so in his younger years. His son, Polynices, also suffers from a tragic arc of his own, being the victim of such a broken family. When he comes to beg Oedipus for his blessing so that he'd be able to defeat his brother in battle, Polynices simply cannot see a reason why he shouldn't kill his own brother. The idea of family had been so violated that it no longer mattered to him. For Oedipus, his own son was a lost cause. In some ways, rejecting him is Oedipus's attempt at breaking a cycle that he created but knows he simply can't do anything about. He's no longer a proud and powerful king who has the right answer to every single riddle and problem that stands before him. Those days have ended, and now he's just a person, like you and me, humbled in spite of his former power and success. He has to face the reality that his time is ending, represented quite literally as he knows he's dying in the play. In the end, according to his wishes, his daughters Antigone and Ismene help Theseus bury him in a hidden location near Athens. His burial provides a blessing to the land in which he rests, a sign that he has devoted all that's left of himself to providing for the few he could actually help in the end. Think about what your character does when they face the tragic reality of an oncoming fall, when they have to accept circumstances they can't escape and they choose to act, when a path leads or has led them to death, pain, or loss, but they decide, I might not be able to change anything, but I'll do what I can. It defines the core of a character, revealing who they are at their truest state. In your story, the outcome can be what you make it. A character's decision or not to willingly accept the tragic fall ultimately defines who they are in relation to their core beliefs, whatever those may be. And like I've said, many great villains are often just characters who refuse to accept the fate of a tragic reality, perhaps even becoming obsessed with trying to change it. Accepting or refusing, both can be explored by heroes and villains. Don't be afraid to play around with the tragic arc and see what it causes your characters to become. There's nothing wrong with the outcome leading a protagonist to failure or even villainy. Failure itself is a natural part of life and growth. Oedipus, picking up the pieces to a broken time in his life when he once had the illusion of happiness, is probably the most relatable thing that I've ever read about an ancient hero. I've never killed my father or married my mother. Neither myself nor the character needed to be taught that it was wrong to do so. But the lesson that was taught was one of persevering in spite of how temporary the glory of a mortal actually is. It's about how our response can teach us about who we are and what actually matters in the end. So when you go and write your heroes and villains, try to incorporate the tragic arc, just to keep those pivotal characters that much more complex and deeper than just being the good guy or bad guy. Have them confront and be forced to navigate their impossible, world-shattering reality and use their response to truly cement their beliefs and values on the page, even if it's completely misguided or wrong. Tragedy can make us delusional, the way Polynices just couldn't understand why he shouldn't kill his brother over a throne and some fleeting power. Tragedy can also make us wise, something for your protagonists to come upon throughout the plot and use to set themselves apart. Do you think the tragic arc should always have a role to play in writing complex characters? Is there any situation where you don't believe it applies? Let me know in the comments down below. Feel free to share how your characters may or may not be tragic in their own way. If you found this video helpful or simply interesting, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Your engagement really helps me out, and I hope to be producing much more content in the future. So if you leave more comments, I might get better ideas on what we'd like to talk about together. Until then, see you later.